Vietnam, America's longest war, its most costly war, its first military defeat, and its most nightmarish national trauma. People are still asking, what went wrong? How and why did the U.S. get involved? Was Vietnam a tragic mistake, as liberals claimed? Did the U.S. lose because of self-imposed constraints, as conservatives claim? Could we have won the war if we just unleashed the military machine and bombed the North Vietnamese back to the Stone Age? What was the cost of Vietnam, the human cost, the political cost, the economic cost to both the United States and the Vietnamese? One person who has been researching these questions for over 10 years is William Gibson, who has just published a book, The Perfect War, Techno-War in Vietnam, with Atlantic Monthly Press. Bill is a graduate of the University of Texas, where he did his undergraduate work, and he got his PhD at Yale University and is now a professor of sociology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And we're very pleased to have you with us today on Alternative Views, Bill, to discuss your Vietnam book.
This is an incredible book, Bill. If you have read a lot about Vietnam, or if you have never read anything about Vietnam, this is the one you should read, because it shows the picture from the top, from the bottom, and it gives an explanation as to what really happened there and why things happened. Usually you come back with kind of an empty feeling of frustration or not really knowing, but after reading your book, you understand, which is incredible thing.
Thank you.
And you get the emotional feeling, the impact, as well as what was happening in the mines. And these incredible stories like how the North Vietnamese were able to bring down American jets just by lying on their back and firing .45s and rifles up into the sky. But I'm getting ahead of the story.
Yes, Bill, let's begin by talking about what, in your opinion, is distinctive about the Vietnam War. What brought about U.S. involvement in this ill-fated adventure?
The most distinctive feature of the Vietnam War is that it was the first war in modern times to be fought from a managerial business perspective. During World War II, U.S. industry made a massive contribution to the war effort, and American military men and political leaders fully appreciated that effort. During World War II, the military partially adopted a business model of organization for their supply operation. After World War II, they began to think of combat as also a production process. The officer corps were seen not as gladiator heroes who were leading men in combat, but as war managers. In turn, the enlisted men were no longer the citizens of a nation, but they were workers. Managers and workers worked on a production line to produce deaths, and the product then was enemy body counts. So just as American society's strength, supposedly, was high technology, capital-intensive business, so too would we fight wars as high technology, capital-intensive warfare, and we would literally drive the other side bankrupt. So it's this production model of war, or what I call techno-war, that distinguishes at a primary structural level Vietnam from other warfare.
So then in this way, we couldn't lose because we were fighting a small, underdeveloped, untechnical third world country with peasants, basically.
Exactly. From an American perspective, if the only thing that counts in warfare is technology and economics, both in your economy and how you translate your economy into your military, then it was impossible for us to lose. It was theoretically impossible for an underdeveloped peasant economy to beat the United States. It just couldn't happen. Therefore, whenever we ran into a problem in 54 or 60 or 64, at every time the U.S. was defeated, we always thought that if we escalated to the next highest level, we would win. It's a closed system.
And Bill, why was Vietnam chosen as the site for the first techno-war?
There's no historical reason for Vietnam. In other words, really Vietnam as a country, as a people, as a culture, didn't really matter to the Americans. So there was nothing about the country per se to make us fight there. It was simply the time when this whole apparatus of warfare was developing vis-a-vis the time when the situation in Vietnam was deteriorating from an American perspective. techno-war, or this production model of war, got its big push in the 50s. Because after World War II, when we had the hydrogen bomb or the atomic bomb, and then later the hydrogen bomb, and the Russians didn't, it seemed clear to us that our mastery of the world was just unsurpassed and we could not be challenged. But when the Russians had the bomb, we were in a situation of potentially mutual destruction, where they could destroy our industrial apparatus, then this made the Americans feel impotent. And so the question came is, how can we develop a form of warfare to exercise our power in the world without threatening nuclear war? And the idea, developed by Dr. Henry Kissinger, who at the time was a professor at political science at Harvard, was what's called limited war. And the idea was, because our economy was so big and powerful, we could have guns and butter. Butter and TVs and popcorn and drive-ins and hula hoops for the Americans at home, and limited war for an indefinite period of time in the Third World. And because we were so much richer, we would just drive the other side bankrupt.
And it was a period where certain guerrilla movements, certain national liberation movements were emerging. We saw the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and there were Third World revolutionary movements throughout Latin America, Africa, South
The French and British empires were deteriorating worldwide. Certainly, and Vietnam's a classic case of that. Vietnam had been a French colony that went through a long process of revolt. So Vietnam was just simply, it was ready. We had our theory for limited war, and we had our apparatus in place at the time Vietnam well, by the time the French had been thrown out.
Can you give us a brief history of Vietnam and their struggle, first against the Chinese and then the French, etc., leading up to American intervention?
Certainly. The word Vietnam originally, it means Southern Kingdom of the Viet, and it was a part of China that, well, didn't really break off. It's like Chinese immigrated there, and they formed a racially distinct group and tried to claim independence. Chinese emperors would invade Vietnam, hold the country for several hundred years. Vietnamese guerrilla fighters would throw the Chinese out. The Chinese would then invade and hold it for another 50, 100 years. Then the Vietnamese would throw them out and hold on for 50 years. This struggle between Vietnam and China for Vietnamese independence went on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Finally, by the time the Vietnamese had finally defeated China, they were weak, though. But this is the time when the West was expanding, and France was looking for a way to get to China for the spice trade and so on, and they ended up taking Vietnam. So France took Vietnam as a colony in the 1890s. Vietnamese fought off and on against the French from the 1890s on up. They just kept on fighting. But then in World War II, the communists, especially headed by Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap and Lê Đức Thọ, organized better. They fought against the Japanese, and then after declared their independence in '45, and ironically, American intelligence operatives supported that effort extensively.
And Ho Chi Minh, as I understand it, looked at that time to the United States as a model to develop his country, not to the Soviet Union.
His position was that he had paid off whatever he felt he ideologically owed to the Soviet Union, and that he was a free agent, he was not getting any assistance, and that the America, with the Declaration of Independence and with its stated anti-imperialist policy, was a far better possible ally.
And it was a model of democracy for him, too, and at that time he was a nationalist and a Democrat to some extent.
Certainly a nationalist. How much a Democrat? I'm not. I wouldn't. He was pretty much.
He at least paid lip service to the democratic values and the anti-imperialist.
But certainly a nationalist.
Yeah. Well, then the Vietnamese defeated the French
in '54 after 8 years of extensive warfare, extensive guerrilla warfare. And it's important for us to understand the war in Vietnam was one country. It had been tentatively divided into 3 administrative zones by the French, but warfare was going on in all 3. When the war ended in '54, the country looked like a checkerboard. Some French in the north, some Vietnamese or Viet Minh in the north. Some French cities held in the south, other areas held by the Vietnamese communists. North and South Vietnam didn't exist. It was only a checkerboard. But then, at the Geneva peace talks in 1954, there was a land swap. Vietnamese forces moved north, French consolidated their forces in the south. a line was drawn, a provisional administrative boundary, not a national boundary, not a political boundary, an administrative zone boundary. And the idea was the country would be divided for 2 years and there would be international elections in '56. There were no such elections. The United States moved in. But what's important to understand, this idea of North Vietnam as a separate country that invaded South Vietnam is wrong. There was no North and South Vietnam as two separate countries. That was it was a checkerboard at the end of '54 that got changed.
And what happened in the South to begin the resistance struggle?
In '54, the Viet Cong in the South were told to put down their guns and that they were going to engage in political struggle for 2 years in preparation for the '56 elections. That became extremely dangerous. Diem, the man the Americans put in power, immediately went after and hunted down most of the communists, leftists, Democrats, nationalists. In other words, Diem and his family ruled Vietnam pretty much as a dictatorship. And finally, by the late '50s, the local communist and guerrilla and socialist and democratic apparatus was taking casualties so badly that they had to renew the armed struggle to survive. And so simply then the southern cadres put pressure on the North, on the Communist Party, to reopen the military front and have a joint political and military strategy as opposed to simply trying to wait for international intervention or by the United Nations or something. So that's the origin of resistance.
And what was the U.S. response to this then?
Well, the response was quite simple. This is when the Green Berets, who had originally been formed to parachute into Eastern Europe to organize guerrilla movements in Eastern Europe, got reformulated as counterinsurgency experts, and they were sent to Vietnam by President Kennedy in 1960. There was also a massive increase in CIA operations. The whole idea of covert warfare, remember, and counterinsurgency warfare, remember we had failed at the Bay of Pigs in 1961? Mm-hmm. And so the idea was that we must become experts at fighting these wars of national liberation, and that we must have new warrior technicians who could intervene in underdeveloped countries and fix things. And the Green Berets were one branch as fix-it men, CIA operatives were another, various logistics people, economists were others. Mm-hmm. We should remember, let's understand the class structure of Vietnam. It's a poor rural society. Most of the people are landless peasants or own very small plots of land. They're under subsistence agriculture, where a large part of their crop goes to the landlord. A small landowning class, most peasants are Buddhist with practiced elements of Confucianism as well. A small landowning class, many of them refugees from the north, many of them Catholic, controls the nation's wealth. So Diem and the government, Diem, uses then the army as a mechanism to collect rents. And during the first war against the French, the Viet Cong had redistributed the land to the peasantry. So when Diem came to power in '54 with the army and acted as agents of the landlord to collect years of back rent, essentially the internal class polarization increased one more time.
And drove people of the Viet Cong into revolutionary perspective.
Exactly.
And then Diem had to use more and more repression as a result of the dissatisfaction of the...
And the repression in turn meant that in essence that the Viet Cong or communist forces felt like they had to resort to armed struggle again.
So this is why you made your statement in your book that Diem had an army, but he was not a government. That's right. No, there was no effective administration other than military administration. Diem eventually replaced all forms of village council, all forms of intermediary powers that had any linkage to below were destroyed. Instead, all loyalty was from the top down.
Yet the American escalation didn't really dramatically accelerate until after Diem's assassination. What brought about this dramatic acceleration and what you call techno-war to Vietnam?
When Diem was gone, all the other Vietnamese generals began a power struggle among themselves. Consequently, whatever government repressive apparatus Diem had collapsed. Desertions increased radically. Defections to Viet Cong units became stronger and stronger. By '64, American policymakers feared that there would be a provisional revolutionary government, an open provisional revolutionary government in much of the countryside, which we had lost. Remember, let's get straight. U.S. forces lost, or the French lost in '45. We lost again in '54. We lost again in '63, '64. We escalate. The United States escalates in the face of defeat, not in the face of victory.
Right.
So, massive defeat in '63 and '64 brought in then the need for U.S. ground troops and sustained bombing of the North in order to try to salvage the situation.
Why couldn't the U.S. accept a defeat in this small corner of the world?
The United States has been unwilling to deal with communism as a political, social, and economic movement. Instead, it gets seen that we as Americans are the natural beings of the world, and that capitalism is the natural economic order, and that our system is simply the essence of human goodness and the essence of nature. Therefore, something very, very different from us is not another society with whom one compares differences and makes treaties with and so on and so forth, but instead is an alien presence. If we're nature, they're anti-nature, or what I call the foreign other. During World War II, the Soviet Union did take over, right after World War II, did invade and take over Eastern Europe. The Red Army did, and you had to hold it as a buffer zone, and they did install puppet dictatorships there. This became the model for all American views of communist and socialist of any kind. Americans did not understand internal revolution. They did not understand the Chinese Revolution in the 40s, that there were like millions upon millions of poor peasants who wanted land to survive, and that Mao Zedong and the Communist Party offered them land and survival, whereas Chiang Kai-shek was a warlord who offered them nothing. So, unable to see internal struggles for socialism or communism, or unable to see even internal struggles for national independence against colonialism, the world gets divided into them and us. And we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. They are the foreign other. They're trying to move in. So all forms of communism movements get seen in that light. So in this sense, then, any particular movement in the world is not just a particular movement in a dirt-poor country. I mean, let's remember how dirt-poor Vietnam is then. And we had very little investment there. Instead, any movement is a sign of the global movement. A victory, a few poor peasants win in Vietnam. That doesn't mean just that that a little few more people have a few more rights. Instead, that means that the foreign other, the monolithic machine, has encroached one more step, and that with each other step, the rest of the world becomes in peril. This, of course, is the domino theory. So like a contagious disease, sort of, instead of like each country having its own history and its own culture and its own people. It's as if the world is an empty shell, like a chessboard, and it's either our side or their side, and once they get going, just somehow a mechanistic momentum will propel communism to victory. It's a very, I call it mechanistic anti-communism, because it's a mechanistic framework of the world, and the enemy is foreign other. They aren't really real enemy at all. It's an abstraction.
So isn't that also, aren't there two sides of this? The other side is the people, the big decision makers, the foreign policy establishment, as you term it, looking at the world on a more realistic basis. As General Maxwell Taylor said in his book, we have to keep an iron grip on the third world country because they're poor and they want riches, and the riches would have to come from us. So they look at any type of victory, such as in Vietnam, as providing an example to other third world countries, that if they can do it and get away with it in Vietnam, they can get away with it in other countries.
So it's a universal sign. The victory in Vietnam is a universal sign of national liberation victory everywhere. A defeat in Vietnam means that all liberation movements will give up their struggles.
So, Bill, given the fact of this military-industrial complex in the United States that had built up a new military machine and model of warfare, given the mechanistic anti-communism that was motivating the foreign policy decisions of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and given the collapse of the Diem South Vietnamese government in Vietnam, it was almost inevitable that U.S. involvement would intensify, that this war was not an accident, that this war was not just a policy mistake, but it was a consequence, basically, of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. industrial and military development since World War II. That this was the test case. This is where they had to test their war machine and stop communism.
I really want to stress together that I am, one of the principal arguments I'm trying to critique in my book is this notion that we just made one mistake after another, that nobody was really responsible for anything, that things just sort of slipped up. You don't go to war that way. You go to war far, far in advance. In '64, when Johnson was making announcements about the Gulf of Tonkin and just sort of like how it was a surprise attack, which it wasn't, and in early '65, when they were making announcements to the American public that maybe we'd send a few thousand more troops to Vietnam, they fully expected to send 200,000 people by the end of '65, another 100,000 by '66, and another 100,000 by '67. The estimates were already there that it'd take 500,000 men.
So they had
it was a
planned
planned-out war. This was a planned warfare, a planned escalation.
Well, let's talk about the war itself and see how this techno-war actually worked out itself in the ground and in the air. The use of helicopters, the helicopter war, and the search and destroy. Can you describe these and how they worked in the...
Well, let me quote a very famous general, Julian Ewell. Generals write books. They're kind of like academicians. They need to write to publish in order to get further promoted up the hierarchy. We normally don't believe that, or think that way, but it's true.
And to justify their actions.
And just to justify their actions. All right, Ewell's book is called Sharpening the Combat Edge, the Use of Analysis to Reinforce Military Judgment. It's published by the Department of the Army. And in the first chapter, Ewell says that we could compare search and destroy operations in Vietnam to an assembly line.
Wow.
That it was literally a war factory, and that the objective was unlike a World War II or World War I, where you have a continuous front going on thousands of miles, and you have major offensives and then a counteroffensive and then a lull. In Vietnam, it's a factory. You turn the factory on, you let it run full blast all the time. And that's the managerial problem. How do you just allocate your resources given the fact that you've already decided to run at maximum capability?
To produce body counts.
To produce body counts. Search and destroy means that somewhere between several hundred and several thousand American soldiers are going to search a block of countryside for Viet Cong or North Vietnamese troops, and they're going to try to engage them in combat and, of course, and destroy whatever troops or whatever supplies they capture. In theory, it's strategic offensive, meaning it's a way to put the Viet Cong, make them weaker, to put them on to hunt them down. It's as if we're hunters and they're the prey. The objective is to kill the enemy so fast that we reach what's called the crossover point. This is General William Westmoreland's term. The crossover point means you're killing the enemy faster than they can replace their casualties. It's like you're going to drive the other side bankrupt. All right, so with all of our high technology, with our helicopters, our jet fighter bombers, our tanks, we'll just grind them up. Now that's the theory. The practice of search and destroy often turned out very differently. In that part of a factory means a set of routine operations. And these routines were quite visible to the Vietnamese. For example, we just didn't all of a sudden show up unannounced into an area and begin the search. Instead, you had to, reconnaissance planes had to go over it. Artillery guns had to shoot smoke rounds into the jungle, into the landing zone, so that all the other artillery guns could sight in so they could fire protective artillery strikes around the landing zone. If you're any kind of Viet Cong commander, if you see a smoke round coming up in the jungle, well, you know that the Americans are getting ready to launch a helicopter assault. There aren't that many clear areas in mountainous territory or in swamps or in jungle. You can tell where the landing zones are. So many times the Viet Cong commanders had a very substantial advance notice upon when the Americans were going to begin an operation. Consequently, they had the choice: do we run and hide, or do we ambush? The Americans then land. The first wave takes the landing zone. The second and third waves bring in more artillery. If you're a Viet Cong commander, you get out your compass and your map. You draw a circle, a radius on their map, and that will tell you, because you know that American artillery, 105mm howitzer, has a 10,000-meter radius. So you know that the Americans will not march further outside the range of their howitzers, so you can tell where the Americans are going to march. Do you run and hide, or do you fight? So the same kind of principle goes on. It's in essence, they knew where we were, but we did not know where they were.
And they had the initiative.
They then had the initiative.
It's their terrain,
It's
too.
their terrain. So in essence, even by the military's own statistics, roughly 3/4 of the battles in Vietnam were initiated by the Viet Cong and NVA, meaning they ambushed U.S. forces and could make a decision. Also, most battles ended when the Viet Cong and NVA wanted them ended. They could initiate contact and break contact. And those are two crucial definitions of combat initiative.
And your other statistic that only in 2% of the search and destroy missions did we actually make contact, original contact with the Vietnamese. So it was their choice the whole time. And as I understand, the soldiers themselves on the ground, they didn't like this because they were the ones who would have to take the casualties first to lure the Vietnamese into battle, so that then the Americans would know where to send the planes and where to send the artillery.
You send out a patrol in order to get it ambushed, in order to mark a target with a smoke rocket from a helicopter, or so that then the jets can come in and napalm the area. In other words, you have to get ambushed before you can find the enemy.
You know, when I began my Vietnam research, I had a hint that I was going to find a very cavalier attitude towards whether or not Vietnamese lived or died. I was surprised to understand the command's attitude towards their own soldiers. But let's think about it. We're talking about a production model of war again, or techno-war.
These are the U.S. war managers.
These are the U.S. war managers. Okay. We have a draft. We can replace all the labor that we lose can be replaced. And indeed, it's like migrant labor force. We're almost sort of like, say, we had a farm when you bring them in for a year, a year or two of duty.
Mostly blacks and Chicanos anyway.
Quite a lot, well, not most, but a whole lot of them are. They're poor, working class whites. The idea was, so what if they walk into an ambush? We take some casualties that way, but then we'll call in our airstrikes and call in our artillery fire, and we'll use our technology then to get the body count. So, in essence, the ground troops were bait. They were being sent out on operations to be ambushed. And that's not a good way to survive in warfare.
Night movement. That was suicide. That was one of the worst patrols you could ever go out on. The purpose of it was for you to walk up on Charlie and for him to hit you, and then for our hardware to wipe them out. We were using scapegoats to find out where they were. That was all we were. Bait. Hell, they couldn't find Charlie any other way. So they loved us to run into a whole bunch of them. That way they could plaster him and they'd have a big body count. Then the general gets another goddamn medal and a big promotion.
Let's also note again, the highest officer routinely on the ground during Vietnam was a captain. A captain was a company commander. A company had at most about 140 people in it. That would be at full strength. Most combat units never operate at full strength. Everyone above captain's level, a battalion commander is the man who commands 4 companies. All battalion level officers, brigades have several battalions, divisions have several regiments or brigades. All the rest of those choppers, all the rest of those commanders are in helicopters, flying at minimum at 1,500 feet, because 1,500 feet is the maximum range of a .50 caliber machine gun when used as an anti-aircraft weapon, which until the latter part of the war was the largest anti-aircraft weapon the Viet Cong had. So the managers were relatively safe in this process, whereas it's the workers who are suffering the occupational safety hazards on the ground.
Was it a success in terms of the numbers and the body counts? Did they actually, in their own inhuman logic, succeed, or were the costs greater than the benefits, even in terms of their own logic?
Several things happened. For one, all the American commanders and helicopters communicated in uncoded English to their subordinate officers and ground troops. The Viet Cong and NVA were able to buy American radios on the black market and capture others. They routinely listened in into all the orders. There are many stories of people of Viet Cong hearing American orders and then taking actions to circumvent them. So the sheer arrogance of, you know, we're in our helicopters, we have all this stuff, we don't have to care, we don't have to pay attention to our enemy, that ended up costing American lives. So that part didn't work. It took, within a year or so, by late '66 or so, the Viet Cong and NVA knew how long it was going to take an American airstrike to get there. Now sometimes they could make a terrible miscalculation and get caught out in the open. But an astute enemy commander could make a reasonable judgment on how long he could stay in combat before he had to run like hell, because the F-4s or the Hueys or the gunships were coming after him. So a lot of times ambushes would be quite brief and the enemy would break off contact.
Well, we've mentioned body count a couple of times. Let's get into that and the whole framework of corruption and lies and cover-ups that occurred in the U.S.
It's simple from what we've followed so far. If the success in war is purely an enemy body count, yes, because we're trying to drive the other side bankrupt, and let's presume that, oh, you and Doug are, I'm a general, and that, like, your lieutenants are captains, right? Maybe you're a company commander somewhere. You're under pressure. I'm under pressure to produce a body count. And as a colonel, let's say I'm a colonel battalion commander, if I don't meet my quota, my career's over with. I'll be relieved of command. And if you're relieved of combat command, then your ticket up the hierarchy is gone. So I'm going to squeeze you. And in fact, in some units, kind of where the informal rule was, if you don't meet your body count quota, then we're going to, like, you're not coming in off the field. We'll just leave you. I'll bring you some more ammo, some more food, some more water, but don't expect, you know, you've got to, like, produce the goods.
I knew if I came back without a body count or at least a prisoner, I'd get my ass chewed. So I kept the patrol out. Well, I talked to to many soldiers who were wounded, the ones I saw in Japan, and they told me that some units were given a quota for the week, and if they didn't get it, they were just sent right back out again.
All right, you're under pressure. You're under severe, severe pressure. So what do? Well, you can do several things. One, you can just invent a body count. You can just out of the thin air and just like say call up and have tell everyone in your unit, tell your entire class there at UT to fire off their M16 for a minute, called a mad minute, and call up on the radio and report that you have a body count of 30 or a body count of 5 or something like that. Or say you get ambushed, Frank, and your whole company gets ambushed, and you call in an airstrike and you call in an artillery strike, and there's an armored unit nearby, and you actually have an engagement and you find some enemy bodies. Well, what are you going to do? Well, if you found 10 bodies and you've got 3 different units, artillery, air, and infantry involved, who's going to get the credit? What if you don't give credit to the artillery? What do you think might happen then? What if you say, you fired but you missed? Does that sound like a wise policy to you?
The artillery commander isn't going to give you any support the
He
next
might
time
be
around.
kind of slow next time around. Or those F-4 pilots might have to have, they might get a little slow too. It's in your interest to reward everyone. And since everyone is under the same system, everyone needs body counts, why sure. We give you 50 Air Force, we give you 50 gunships, we give you 50 artillery, and we on the ground, well, I've got 5 bodies and I've got 5 rifles, we'll count each rifle as 5 persons killed, so that gives us 25. And while we were out stumbling around, we found 10 enemy grenades. I beg your pardon, 10 graves. We'll count them too.
And body parts.
In body parts, say we find an arm or a leg, and say because sometimes really when the airstrikes did hit, you can't blow people to smithereens. Unlike the war movie where everyone has a nice discreet death, in a real war, it's quite gruesome. There are stories of where people from different units had to fight over arms and legs to determine who was going to get the kill count for their unit.
And of course it got even more pernicious because they would slaughter Vietnamese civilians and include them, I mean children, women, old people, include them as part of the body count as well.
Well, we should get clear on that. In some areas of the war where U.S. forces were fighting uniformed North Vietnamese troops, there weren't too many civilian casualties. But a whole lot of Vietnam battles occurred way inside the country where there were Viet Cong, and Viet Cong and the villagers were very much the same people.
Well, now on search and destroy missions, they told us to kill everything that moves. So we killed everybody. Well, I just happened to be standing alongside the officer when the radio man said, "Look, sir, we've got some children rounded up. What do you want us to do with them?" And the officer says, "God damn it, Marine, you know what to do with them. Kill the bastards. If you ain't got the goddamn balls to kill a Marine, I'll come down and kill the bastards myself." And the Marine said, "Yes, sir," and hung up the phone. And about 2 or 3 minutes later, I heard a lot of automatic fire and a lot of children screaming. I heard babies crying. I heard children screaming their lungs out.
Search and destroy reached the point where if many units burned down villages routinely, and then you go in a village and you burn it, and you see their bunkers there, because everyone in Vietnam had a bunker to hide in, and you hear a noise, and maybe you scream and try to get somebody out, but maybe you just throw the grenade in, or people start to run away from you. And well, if they run from you, they must be your enemy. And so you shoot them, and you say, well, running becomes a sign of an enemy.
Well, we'd been out for about 3 hours, and really hadn't seen anything. It was too hot. But then I saw this figure in black pajamas running along a paddy dike about 300 meters ahead and to the left. And, "Oh, hey, I got one," I hollered. 10 o'clock, he's mine." Then I muttered the warning to halt, regulations. Don't lie, don't lie. So I dropped to one knee, squeezed the trigger. Crack! The figure in black went flying like a piece of paper in a gust of wind. "Ho, we got some," Morgan shouted. "Nice shot, baby, nice shot," said Newcomb. When we reached the body, I nudged the corpse face up with my boot. It was a woman, about 55 to 60. And Wally says, "Stupid gook, what'd she run for?" We were in a free fire zone, and we saw a woman and a child running across, and the captain says, "Well, they're running." Well, in the free fire zone, if they're running, they're wrong. They're the enemy. So we shot them. The whole squad opened up on them. The next morning we went out, and we could see the cap of a child that was bloodied, and you could see where the mother had dragged the child away.
Troops they're afraid, they're trying to survive, they're in a desperate situation, they're under a high pressure to produce a body count. So yes, we got into sustained slaughter of Vietnamese villagers. You go through and you look at a man's hands, and if he's a true farmer, he has calluses, and if he's a guerrilla who's only a fake farmer, he doesn't. So you go and you look at the hands, and if he doesn't have enough calluses, then you haul him away and you send him to an interrogation center. Or you look at the ankles. If a man is a gorilla, he must be running out there in the jungle getting his ankles all scratched up. Where if he's a farmer, he wouldn't have so many scratches. So people would go, American soldiers would go around and look at the ankles. Or if he's a gorilla, if you're a farmer by day and a fighter by night, you must not be getting much sleep. So you've got to have circles under your eyes. So U.S. soldiers would go in and look into the eyes of the Vietnamese and try to decide how many bags they had, and then if you have too many bags, you get hauled off. It was not our country. It was not our culture. We did not speak the language. And by the American way of looking at war, language, culture, history, class structure, these matters didn't matter. What mattered is we had the hardware and they didn't.
Well, as the pilot of a helicopter gunship, we had a rule about the use of evasive action. Anyone taking evasive action could be fired upon. They never explained why, or even what it was. But anyway, there was one incident I recall where we flew over a large rice paddy, and there were some people down there working in the rice paddy, maybe a dozen or 15 individuals, and we passed over their heads. Well, they didn't take any action, but we could tell they were nervous, but they didn't try to hide or anything. So we hovered just a few feet off the ground among them with our 2 helicopters, and we turned on our police sirens, and boy, when they heard the police sirens, they started to disperse. And so we opened up on them, just shot them all down. Well, it was 6:30 in the evening, and still daylight, and they said there was some VC out there, and they called on us, so we fired out there and killed off 7 of them. Well, the word comes back to us that we killed 7 rice farmers carrying their hoes. They're trying to make it back to the village. You see, we'd set up this curfew, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., and so it was up to them to be out of there by that time. But hell, they didn't carry any wristwatches. They didn't have any idea what time it was.
So, yes, people got hauled away for interrogation and never came back. Yes, many villages were burned to the ground and blown up. And yes, many Vietnamese men, women, children, chickens, water buffalo, pigs, piglets, often were killed. Oftentimes when you went into a village, the stories are you shot everything.
And burned the crops.
And burned the crops. And that was...
houses.
Hmm?
And their houses.
And their houses.
Boy, you know, if the people don't treat you right when you walk through that village, you can give them hell. Yeah, they give you that snotty look they can do. You know, they won't say nothing to you. And we expected them to run out and welcome us like that World War II type of stuff. You know, hey, GI, hey. Well, as soon as we step outside the village, the captain radios in, "We're under heavy contact." Then right away, oh, those Phantom jets start coming in and dropping them 500-pound bombs. The whole village is leveled. And we go on to the next village. And that is search and destroy.
All this was, I guess, part of what you call the Mir Guk rule.
Yes, essentially, if it's dead and it's Vietnamese, it's VC. You know, what it is armies have documents called rules of engagements that are supposed to specify when you can open up fire and when you can't.
On civilians.
Or on anyone.
Right.
But they weren't used much at all.
Mm.
Instead, other kind of rules happen. Like I said, if they run, they're an enemy. Mm-hmm. Or if they have black pajamas, that was one rule. Some units thought that any Vietnamese wearing black garb was the enemy. Of course, all peasants that wore that as their national dress. So there are all kinds of these fake rules that supposedly distinguish friend from foe. Mm-hmm. But all these rules were wrong in that we just didn't know the culture. They were kind of like fabrications that Americans invented to try to make themselves feel legitimate about who got shot. And but ultimately, people saw through this and said, look, what's in practice is this is the Mir Guk rule. If it's dead and it's Vietnamese, it's VC. Any Vietnamese we shoot, we're going to count. There's
also the factor of racism, too. I wonder how much they would have done this if they'd been fighting Germans.
Oh, it's probably much less. Of course, it says Guk, slope, slant, dink.
One definition of a dead Vietnamese was believers. If they'd been napalmed, they were called crispy critters. And a one-liner went, "When we killed a pregnant woman, we counted as 2 VC. 1 soldier and 1 cadet. Now what you do is you load all the friendly Vietnamese, onto ships and take them out to the South China Sea. And then you bomb the country flat. Then you sink the ships. I'd like to burn the whole country down and then start again with Americans. Bomb the schools and churches, bomb the rice fields too. Show the children in the courtyards just what napalm can do. Strafe the town and kill the people, drop napalm in the square. Get out early every Sunday and catch 'em at their morning prayer. Throw candy to the Arvin, gather them all around. Take your 20-millimeter cannon and mow the bastards down.
Yeah, and this also tapped a certain sadism, not only in soldiers in the field, but also intelligence people. There were people who would, collect ears and fingers and even heads, and even intelligence people would admit that they really got off to beating up the people they were interrogating. It gave them a nice buzz, a thrill to do it.
When you go through soldiers' novels and memoirs, many have made valiant efforts to try to talk about the perverse eroticism of warfare. Sadism, clearly a very strong sadist dimensions, a lot of rape in the field, as well as killing, or a lot of rapes followed by killings and mutilations.
Well, maybe 4 or 5 of us, we'd go into the village and take a girl and bring her out into the jungle. We'd tell her to lie on the ground and don't scream, otherwise we'd kill her immediately. And then, how many of her guys there were? Well, they did what they want to with her. If the guys were in a good mood, they let her go. If they weren't, they'd kill her. Well, the girls were unconscious after they'd been repeatedly raped. And then after they got through raping them, 3 of the GIs took hand flares and they shoved them in the girls' vaginas. The girls were bleeding from their mouths and noses and faces and vaginas. Then the GIs lighted the exterior portion of the flares, and they exploded inside the girls. Their stomachs just exploded. Well, one day I was driving on a back road, and a guy comes over to me and he says he needs some gasoline. Didn't say why. Well, I look over and I see this girl, and she's stripped and she's tied to 2 wooden stakes. I don't know what they'd done to her before I got there. Well, they poured gasoline all over the girl and they lighted it. They lit it, and then they just stood there and watched her burn up.
If you look at a body count system and you see if that's the only thing that counts, right? The body count. If that's what rewards and punishments are distributed by, if that's your ethic, and if your own command doesn't really care whether you survive, then clearly you're in a world where anything goes.
It becomes a brutalized war for survival.
It becomes a war for survival, or a war to hold on to your ethics. I think a good example of this, Oliver Stone's movie Platoon, which is currently in releasement, shows a U.S. military unit that's severely divided between one group who commits atrocities and others who thinks it's a horrible, horrible situation. And I think that's a good illustration of probably the kind of dynamics that occurred in many, many units. It isn't as if everyone is a killer or a sadist. It's as if you're in a structure where a significant component of your troops engage in such behavior, but not everyone.
So it seems that then, we talk about atrocities, and we talk about My Lai. When you use that term atrocity...
It applies an exception to the rule. That's not a good way to look at it here.
But My Lai and atrocities were just business as usual.
Yes. My Lai seems a little well organized, in particular well organized, but certainly Certainly My Lai wasn't the only village in Vietnam that was burned down and where everybody inside it was shot. That is not true at all.
In fact, Bill, it was precisely this inability on the ground war to distinguish between friend and foe, VC and peasant farmer, that led to the next dimension of techno-war, the pacification programs. The fact that they weren't able to tell who the enemy was meant that they had to clear out the whole countryside.
Certainly. Simply, if you can't tell friend from foe, then you depopulate the countryside and move them into concentration camps and move them into urban slums. It's not easy to depopulate a countryside. There are several major techniques. One is defoliation. You simply destroy the food base of the country. And this is where Agent Orange comes in. Agent Orange and Agent Blue and Agent White were sprayed on millions of acres of cropland. Other millions of acres of forest were defoliated. So with the food base gone, people have to move. Secondly, certainly bombing attacks on villages, which were quite extensive, encourage people to move. And then third, actual search and destroy operations where villages, some of which everyone is killed, others of which you simply surround the village, move everyone out, then burn up the village and remove them. These three modes. Millions and millions of Vietnamese lost their homes and were sent to concentration camps into urban slums. And what's so interesting is the Americans saw this as progress. This was urbanization. Rural is bad, urban is good. So even though they have nothing, it was brought as seen as a sign of progress to bring Vietnamese in where you could show them TV and make them work in American bases and so on and so forth. It was seen as having a more sophisticated job than being a peasant farmer.
This is also part of that same syndrome of not seeing the enemy as a culture or as individuals or people, but seeing them just as mirror images of ourselves, like the bombing of North Vietnam was supposed to hurt them if they destroyed their capacity to have consumer goods.
Certainly, and so the same idea, you would think from the American perspective that no Vietnamese cared about their home, that they didn't care about their land and their dog and their ancestors' grave and their rice fields and their trees, that instead simply just to have this new good, have this, quote, consumer good or live in the urban area, that in itself was just an unmitigated good. You're right, people's lives were not important. The human dimension was completely lost. And instead, in Americans then, we can count how many TVs were imported this month, how many Hondas.
Yeah, so the logic of techno-war was inapplicable to Vietnam in a way.
Certainly, that's exactly. It could, in many ways, it created tremendous destruction, but it could not stop a very powerfully united people who were trying to change their lives.
In fact, this will be our topic for our next program. We're running out of time for today. And next week, we'll see the limitations of techno-war, of why it failed in Vietnam. We'll also discuss what's wrong with the liberal and conservative interpretations of Vietnam. We'll see what lessons we can draw from the Vietnam experience.
We also will talk about some other aspects of the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive, for instance. That was a big turning point in the war, and a lot of revisionist historians, particularly conservatives, said that it was an American victory. Was it or was it not? We'll also talk about this fascinating phenomenon in which the American Army pretty much refused to fight, or many elements in it did. As a matter of fact, they started attacking their own officers and senior enlisted people in this phenomenon known as fragging.
And we'll conclude with a discussion of some of the parallels to Central America, of some of the failures of U.S. policy in Central America and how they can be illuminated by the failures of the policy in Vietnam. So, Bill, thanks for coming tonight.
Thanks, Doug.
This was
thanks,
an interesting, informative discussion, and we'll look forward to next week.
Welcome to Alternative Views. This is the second on our two-part series about the Vietnam War with Bill Gibson, who wrote an incredible book about the Vietnam War called The Perfect War, Techno-War.
And his book, The Perfect War, Techno-War in Vietnam, was recently published by Atlantic Monthly Press and has so far received some extremely good reviews. It was favorably reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. Kirkus Review described it as a perceptive, cogent, significant, and so far the best analysis of the meaning of America's only military defeat. Highly recommended. Gloria Emerson, in a review, described the book as, although many valuable books on the war exist as records of pain and endurance, there is no work that achieves what this does. Because he might just save us from our most comfortable lies and sad delusions, William Gibson should be honored. And John Stockwell describes this book as, in all of my research on the subject, I have found nothing to compare with Dr. Gibson's Perfect War for invaluable insights into U.S. methodology and its hideous results in the war.
Tonight we're going to talk about the things we didn't cover. We're going to talk about Tet, the importance of that, the Tet Offensive. We're going to talk about how the United States Army, a lot of them didn't, they decided they weren't going to fight that war anymore. We're going to have an evaluation of the Vietnam War. How did people look at it from various aspects? And we'll also take a final look at, have we learned our lessons, or are we still fighting techno-war in Central America, or at least planning to?
What is your interpretation of techno-war? How do we get involved in Vietnam?
Techno-war means you fight war as a production process. The military became deeply impressed with big business's contributions in World War II. After World War II, the military then decided that not only would the supply operations be organized along corporate lines, but that actual conduct of warfare would be organized along corporate lines. The officer corps were the managers, the enlisted men were the workers. The product was enemy body count. Just as American business prided itself on high technology, capital-intensive production systems, so too would our military have high technology, capital-intensive warfare to outproduce. We would kill more of them than they would of us. That's techno-war. Why was it applied in Vietnam? Because after World War, in the 50s, the Soviets had the atomic bomb. They could then destroy our economy, or the base of our power, if we intervened militarily in the world with too much force. The object then was to fight limited war for indefinitely in the third world. We would just send our production system over there and drive the other side bankrupt. Why Vietnam? Americans saw communism not as another type of social organization, as another culture, as another political system, but instead they saw Americans as the good, the natural, the godlike, and the communism was a foreign other, an alien kind of being. The world was divided into simply two types of people, communist and non-communist, and therefore it was like debit or credit, their side or our side. By the time the Vietnamese overthrew the French in the late 50s, we had our theory of limited war intact, we had our conventional forces ready to go. By the late 50s, Vietnam was simply a convenient place to test out this new theory of warfare, techno-war, and a place to drive the foreign other back.
In fact, you pointed out something fascinating in your book about how a major part of U.S. support at a certain part of the war was to win the hearts and the minds of the Vietnamese through importing U.S. commodities to them.
Yes.
And the U.S. government actually put up the money to import these commodities and created the whole infrastructure for it. And rather than winning the hearts and minds of the overwhelming majority of the Vietnamese people, it just created more corruption and inequality. Do you want to talk about that aspect of U.S. policy?
It's just hard for us to realize how much money was poured into that country in so many ways. If you were a high Vietnamese general or colonel in the South Vietnamese government, army positions were like business positions. And most American aid was for sale on the international market by the time it arrived. The level of theft is unbelievably high, and the only reason, it's like rather than try to control the theft, the American government essentially made the decision, look, theft by the officer corps is the price we have to pay for continuing the war. So therefore, in order that something reaches the Vietnamese people, we'll just send more and more and more. And there was an element of truth in that, but also the greater truth was that simply corruption became compounded and the riches became greater. We're talking about millions and millions upon hundreds of millions of dollars made, or even currency manipulation. Currency fraud was endemic. If you knew how to play the game, you could get rich simply by exchanging your money from dollars to piastres to military script and back again. You know, just nothing, just by playing with the rules a little bit. So, but it didn't It created massive inflation. It meant that life for most people got worse. What were your jobs available while a few people on top were able to make money off this stealing the American aid? On the bottom, what were your jobs open for you? Well, you could work for the Americans. You could work on their base. You could be an interpreter, maybe if you had minimal language skills. These are all if you're a man. If you're a woman, the estimates are that there were like 500,000 Vietnamese women engaged in some kind of commercial sex. Prostitution, massage parlors, however you want to call it, hooch girls. It's a whole multi-levered sexual marketplace.
Drugs is another major business factor.
Huge heroin importation coming from all places, coming from Laos. And the CIA was running a war in Laos with the Hills people and with the Laotian government. In order to buy the leaders of the Hills people and buy the Laotian government, they had to acquiesce to the heroin trade. Tons of heroin were brought in on Air America planes and Vietnamese Air Force planes, were refined in Bangkok and other places and sold to U.S. soldiers in Vietnam.
South Vietnamese civil and military leadership was also heavily involved in the narcotics business. General and subsequent President of the Republic of Vietnam, Nguyen Van Thieu, ran one major operation, while Nguyen Cao Ky, at times Air Marshal, Premier, and Vice President, ran another.
For orphans, what could you do? Shoe shine business wasn't something kids had to make money on the side. Shining shoes was life or death issue. Going through garbage dumps. You know, a very dismal life in this new urban Vietnam, not a consumer paradise.
And then the other hand, you had the black market, where, as you say in your book, you could buy anything. You could even buy tanks, armored personnel carriers, and of course the Viet Cong were tapping
Vietnam
into
could
this.
equip themselves whenever they needed American goods. They could equip themselves without any problem. Yeah.
The other aspect of U.S. policy was air war. Part of your most brilliant chapters and descriptions in your book are of the magnitude and nature of the air war in Vietnam that was mainly, I guess, directed against North Vietnam. Do you want to discuss some elements of air war?
If war is a factory, then clearly when you look at air war, we've got the biggest factory and they have nothing. By American reasoning, the North Vietnamese should have given up the day the first bombs dropped on North Vietnam, because they had such a small industrial apparatus, such a small number of bridges and things, that you would think they would have just given up. But they didn't. They were willing to sacrifice their industrial apparatus. They were willing to absorb massive casualties. And indeed, contrary to American mythology, where the Viet Cong were simply being totally supported from the north, roughly 80% of the supplies the Viet Cong used, and even the 80% of the supplies the NVA used, were raised in the south. A small number of supplies were sent south. It couldn't be stopped. No matter how hard the U.S. bombed, no matter how much it escalated its campaigns, no matter even after they closed the ports at Haiphong and started systematically bombing the railroad lines between China and Vietnam, it couldn't stop it. The number of supplies wasn't that great. On the other hand, the air war did mobilize the North Vietnamese people to a considerable degree. Everyone had a job of one kind or another, either repairing the railroads, repairing the roads, or taking over industry, or working in agriculture. So it mobilized and consolidated that society to carry on, much like the Nazi attack on Great Britain consolidated British morale in World War II.
But on the other hand, people used to say, well, we ought to bomb them back to the Stone Age, and we just practically did, didn't we?
Most people don't recognize that the United States Air Force and Navy dropped between 8 million and 15 million tons of bombs and rockets on Southeast Asia. In all of World War II, the United States dropped 2.1 million tons. So the minimum estimate then is about 4 times greater than World War II, and it goes up to almost 8 times greater than World War II. In Westmoreland's 1967 report, he has a target category summary, and the largest category in there after vehicles is buildings. When you listen to the reports of foreign observers on the ground, what they report is just about any modern stone or brick structure over one story was hit. Because those were the only things that looked like targets. And in essence, a lot of those were churches, a lot of them were hospitals, a lot of them were schools. Yes, North Vietnam was bombed back to the Stone Age. There's no doubt about that.
But because they were not fighting a techno-war, that they
it
were
did
still...
cripple them.
Now, we saw in the previous program where this production assembly line type of attitude resulted in the demand for body count for the land troops. In the air war, they also had production quotas, did they not?
And the organization of this was, the unit of measurement is called a sortie. That's one flight by one airplane. And Air Force squadrons, wings, Air Force, large units have rates of production that they are supposed to meet. The Navy and the Air Force and indeed were in competition with each other to see who could, quote, be the most productive. Therefore, the object was to fly as many missions as possible within a finite period of time, like a week or a month or whatever. So rather than pay attention to really what you were bombing or to pay attention to the safest way to protect your pilots and the way to minimize civilian casualties, instead, military war managers devised ways to maximize sortie rates and consequently entered into serious irrational behavior. Like in ground war, where U.S. commander treated their own ground troops as expendable, higher command treated pilots as expendable. They would often be sent on missions on, say, looking for trucks in the middle of rainstorms when it's impossible to see trucks because the ground, you can't even see the ground when you're 500 feet above it. But that keeps the sortie rate high. Or also, say you're supposed to, it's raining over a given target and the target's clouded in, but you still send your planes up there every day, 5 days in a row by the exact same route in order so that, because that's simply, it's like a factory, you keep doing the same routine.
We sure telegraphed our punches. There weren't all that many targets in that area, and it didn't take too many smarts to figure out about where the Air Force was headed. Especially when we headed them there day after day, making them fly up to the target before making the go or no-go decision on the weather that we already knew was not acceptable. And then we turned over the target and came back again the next day to try again.
What this meant for pilots was that they died, because the Vietnamese clearly understood where the Americans were flying the same pattern every day, and they understood that they would just keep coming. So what frequently Vietnamese did was simply move more and more anti-aircraft guns into an area that the Americans for some reason wanted to bomb. And what ended up is American pilots ended up just fighting flying missions against empty targets surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of anti-aircraft weapons. And in this way, by telegraphing our punches, American pilots died.
I talked with a couple of nearly apoplectic F-4 pilots at Da Nang who told me they'd gone out recently on a 4-plane mission carrying a very small bomb load. One pilot told me he was gritting his teeth, he was so mad. We risked 8 guys, he said, when we could have hung the whole load on one plane, risking only 2 people, and done the job better. Well, then I asked him, well, why did they send out 4 planes? The pilot said, damned if I know, unless it's just to keep our sortie rate high. But I tell you this, it's a goddamn crime. Well, I heard about this sortie business on aircraft carrier Constellation. The Navy pilots had told me they could do a better job with a few A-6s operating in the safety of darkness than with all those Skyhawks skimming around with light loads in daylight. So while it didn't seem possible, it appeared that the Navy was trying to out-sortie the Air Force, and the Air Force was trying to out-sortie the Navy. And the guys who were flying the sorties took a dim view of it.
You had an incredible story in your book about how the North Vietnamese would actually bring down the American jets with handguns and rifles. That almost seems unbelievable to us in
In an advanced, from an American standpoint, it is unbelievable in that you only see advanced technology system like a jet fighter bomber needs another advanced technology like a SAM missile in order to bring it down. And there is some amount of truth in that. But North Vietnam underwent a tremendous social mobilization. Part of that mobilization involved giving almost everyone a gun, either a pistol, a submachine gun, a rifle, or whatever, or light machine guns. The entire society was organized as a giant anti-aircraft system. And for really low level, Vietnamese peasants were under instructions to simply get out in the fields en masse, lie down, and shoot up in the air to try to provide a barrage that would make low altitudes unsafe for American pilots. And it happened. American fighter pilots do report that many planes were shot down at extremely low level by peasants. And what this meant to them, low-level flight became so dangerous they had to move higher up where they could consistently be picked up on radar. In other words, it isn't just that peasants could shoot down planes, it's that they denied an airspace to Americans that made all air operations more hazardous. So social mobilization was able to compensate for technological inferiority.
There was another example of this in the Ho Chi Minh Trail when the United States built that incredibly expensive electronic warfare area, which the Vietnamese and the Laotians were able to overcome with very simple tricks.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff always wanted to invade North Vietnam and simply take over Hanoi and Haiphong, or have ground troops in Laos. There is a place where between Laos and Thailand, between the South China Sea and Thailand is something like 35 miles, and so wide. So the effort is, the mission was we'll just form this magic line and we'll keep the foreign other out, right? We'll stop them at the pass, literally. But since that was seen as too expensive in terms of troop lives, they seeded that area with electronic sensors, listening devices that picked up smell, sensors of various kinds. These devices in turn sent radio signals to circling aircraft. The aircraft in turn sent them to computer banks in Thailand. And Thailand in turn organized airstrikes over the trail. But two things happened. One, the sensors were decoyed. Bags of urine hung in trees, tape recorders with cricket noises. In order to try to mask the movement of trucks, you find a sensor and you put normal jungle noises, a tape of normal jungle noises next to it. So you mask the sensors in one area while you actually send your troops and operations on the other. Or, say you get attacked and you were all convoy drivers, truck drivers. North Vietnamese had satchels of grenades. They had rocket flares. A lot of this battle is occurring at night. So the Vietnamese would throw out explosives to make the Americans feel like they were hitting something. And the Americans, in turn, wanted to believe that they were destroying Vietnamese truck convoys. Why? Because pilots are rewarded on the basis of productivity. They're majors and lieutenant colonels. Most of them want to be full colonels, and probably some are desperately want to be brigadier generals. They need to be productive. Therefore, their tendency is to report as high a destruction of trucks as possible. And that the big joke eventually became in intelligence was that the next day when reconnaissance flights would fly out along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they could never find the truck carcasses in anywhere near the numbers that the pilots reported destroyed. So the legend began that deep in the Laotian jungles lived the Great Truck Eater. And the Great Truck Eater was a monster that totally loved dead trucks, and it lives a nocturnal beast, and that every night it got up and it ate the skeletons of dead trucks, so that when the reconnaissance planes came out in the morning, there would simply be no records. This is not to say thousands of trucks were destroyed, but never to the extent necessary. Remember, relatively few supplies were sent south. By American calculations, something like 12 tons a day was enough to support the war in the South. You can put 12 tons on a semi-tractor truck without any problem and have room to spare. Or even if you multiply it by figure 15 or 20-fold, say so you have 20 tractor-trailer trucks a day on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or 40 pickups or whatever. That's still such a small number that even a very extensive air war has a hard time or cannot stop that level of supplies.
Bill, most of the military generals and participants in the war whose memoirs you read and documents you studied indicated that the U.S. really won most of the battles of the war, that the U.S.
In their records, yes.
Right, was on its way to victory, and in particular there's a right-wing revisionist view that the U.S. could have won the war at the time of the Tet Offensive.
Right, the U.S. buildup of main force units, ground troops, began in '65. By the end of '67, we had somewhat over 400,000, I think 450,000, maybe even as high as 500,000 troops in country. According to American records, the official records kept in the Pentagon and kept at Military Assistance Command Vietnam, we had just about destroyed all the Viet Cong troops. They were all nearly decimated. Now, why was that? Because our records were falsified.
Right.
As we began, as I talked about last time, once you move into war's production process and the officers or managers, they lose their sense of fidelity to their subordinates below and sense of their fidelity to the truth. Upward mobility, just like in business where man would be going up, up the ladder is the name of the game. That was the ladder in the military. The currency in warfare was to report the body count. So everybody upped their body count. Fake body counts were routine, not the exceptional. And at each level, the body counts kept getting higher and higher. As the reports went up the chain of command, the larger the figures became.
Well, the first report I would send in was from the facts, from the information we collected, and it was objective as it could be. Then we sent it in, but then it would always come back, doctored up from higher headquarters. That was standard operating procedure when I was brigade historian there. So the result is that the battle news was edited and revised until it was acceptable to the higher-ups. Hell, I've been ordered to write open lies on our civil aid program, such as increasing the 15 English classes to 300 to make it look good to the politicians and the people back home. And I've been ordered to raise the figures for food distribution in refugee villages. But I've also had to retype battle reports omitting certain facts and thereby turning a North Vietnam Army victory over superior American forces into a U.S. victory.
So on paper, we had won. But in reality, two things, that was part one of our victory. The second point was, in 1967, the American higher command decided that Viet Cong guerrillas no longer existed and so they abolished them on paper. Because just like American forces, we don't have any part-time guerrillas or full-time guerrillas. And also, do guerrillas have tanks? Do guerrillas have helicopters? Do guerrillas have heavy artillery? They don't have as much hardware as we do, so they aren't really a threat to American units. So several 100,000 Viet Cong guerrillas were abolished from what's called the order of battle. So once you eliminate the guerrillas on paper, and then you have a lower total estimate of enemy forces, and you have an inflated estimate of how many of those you've killed, well, we'd won. Lyndon Johnson desperately needed a political victory in the fall of '67. So he got General Westmoreland to come back and say, we're winning, that we're soon going to enter into phase 3, and that is we're going to mop up for a couple of years. Now, what was happening in reality? In reality, the Viet Cong forces, the local forces, had expanded radically from 1964 through late 1967. According to U.S. figures, there were only about 200,000 Viet Cong. But when one CIA man started going through the files and trying to refigure things, he calculated about 500,000. And let's understand what that means. If the CIA man is doubling the estimate, that essentially means they don't have any idea of how many of them are there, but it means a double is probably the highest figure he can get away with and still be listened to by anyone. So, in reality, the enemy is gaining strength. We have through the Viet Cong. We have North Vietnamese participation still around 50,000 troops a year being sent south in the border zones along the Cambodian and Laotian borders, and in certain the I Corps, the north of the country. And the U.S. strategic offensive had failed of search and destroy. The bombing operations had failed. In late January, early February 1968, the Viet Cong forces attacked en masse simultaneously for the first time. Normally, they fought very dispersed operations. They were not this was the first time there had been a simultaneous national attack. The attack succeeded in driving, it ended the pacification war. All the units involved in pacification were driven out of the countryside into the cities. Almost all of the Vietnamese and American ground force units were driven out of the countryside back into the cities to defend the cities there. And some Viet Cong forces entered cities, Saigon, Hue, regional capitals, and we began to battle in the cities. Now what happened? After a few weeks, the Viet Cong withdrew from the cities. Their casualties were extremely high. They had not anticipated that the Americans would bomb and conduct artillery strikes inside the cities, but they did. So a large part of South Vietnam was reduced to rubble. Their casualties were high, but the Americans and South Vietnamese army units were gone from the countryside. Desertions had been massive, and the Viet Cong were able to recruit many people. Now that there were no opposing forces in the countryside, their political cadres were able to surface. So they were weakened in many ways, but on the other hand, they had achieved a decisive victory in driving their opponents out of the countryside. Now, from what is the legend then, because American forces were able to kill many of the commandos and Viet Cong troops inside the cities, the Americans, General Westmoreland, declared victory. Of course, this ignores the fact that although he's driven the Viet Cong out of the cities, he himself has been driven out of the countryside, and they just made a mockery out of his own previous claims of victory. Also, it's clear to many people that there were far more enemies in South Vietnam than the Americans have been willing to admit. Westmoreland then made a troop request for another 200,000 soldiers. This troop request went under severe analysis. And essentially what was found was that if within the production model of war, if you were just going to fight the same kind of warfare but simply add more resources to it, still, the Viet Cong alone, just the people in the South, could fight on for another 4 or 5 years, or at least 3 years to 4 years, and then with any with significant North Vietnamese participation, they could fight on 10 to 20 years. In other words, we just could not drive the other side bankrupt.
And you're saying that the North Vietnamese Army basically hadn't participated
not
all
in
that
Tet,
much?
not in Tet. The North Vietnamese Army did not participate in Tet.
Okay.
In fact, in most of the war, they really played a minimal role when you consider the number of Viet Cong troops in proportion to the number of North Vietnamese
Well,
troops.
that's true up until 68. After 68, they entered the war in larger numbers.
Okay.
The Viet Cong were hit. In other words, certainly the conservative claim that the Viet Cong took severe losses in the Tet Offensive is true. The claim that they were decimated and defeated is false, and the claim that the Americans won Tet is false. Tet essentially helped the American war managers, at least the part of them, see that their strategy was bankrupt and that there was no path to victory.
So this finally created a...
Remember, Lyndon Johnson resigned somewhere during this period.
That's right, not too long afterward. Was this kind of a break in their self-delusion that techno-war would win everything?
Now here is a serious problem that people do not understand. American television news began from late 1968 on, began to report the idea that the war was winding down and that we were on our way out. This is not true. This is a false statement. You should never believe this. When you look at the casualty figures of how many American soldiers were killed from 65 through 68, through 67, and then you take 68, and then you look 69 through 73. The 69 through 73 is just about, is within a couple of hundred, as high as the number of killed 65 through 67.
So
search and destroy continued way on until Oh, late 71.
So what was it then that finally convinced the U.S. foreign policy establishment or the U.S. public that Vietnam couldn't be won?
From mid-68 on, the American military began to become progressively more restless, and certainly by late 69, 70s, in active revolt against its commanders. Remember that 75% of the battles in Vietnam were initiated by the enemy, and the average American grunt spent his tour of duty, those few who were combat troops, spent his tour of duty walking into ambushes. Most men learned fairly quickly that while they were walking into ambushes, that their generals were getting medals and they were safe in helicopters and so on and so forth. So people began what's called fragging. Fragging means you take a fragmentation grenade and you throw it at your superior, whether it's a non-commissioned officer, sergeant, or a lieutenant, or a captain, or whatever. It was a way to tell higher command not to treat the ground troops' lives frivolously, that they would not aggressively pursue dangerous combat situations that simply in order to make the superiors look good.
Well, let me tell you how it worked. We'd start having war calls, which is like, at midnight, everybody in the outfit starts opening fire and screaming, "Gooks on the wire, gooks on the wire," in the barbed wire fences, you know. And then you'd try to kill any of the lifers that you didn't like. So we tried to get the CO a couple of times with the machine gun. One time his rack took 9 holes, his cot, 9 bullet holes, but he dove out of it and got away. Everybody'd be shooting, so he couldn't check the weapon, see who was shooting him. So they'd be throwing grenades at the wire and yelling and shouting, "Gooks on the wire, gooks," and they'd blow the siren and then run around, and half the guys would be facing out where it's shooting, and then the other half would be waiting for a lifer to come out of his tent. Yeah, I've seen officers executed 5 or 6 times. Just put a price on his head. Next one that kills him gets the money. Next time he was out on a mission, everybody knew it was going to happen. They just wait till he was in the right position.
And the estimates run quite high. And there was the official Army count is about 650 fragging incidents. And there are real reasons to doubt that. Because let's say...
It must have been quite small. I'm sure there were a lot of them that weren't reported.
Oh, of course, because no commander wants to have, what do you say? It's like some of my own men threw a grenade at me or tried to shoot me. I mean, how is that going to look good on your record? Are you going to get promoted up as a great leader when you're reporting that your own people are shooting at you? No, I'm sure the records are, the figures must be substantially higher.
The soldiers even put pools of money out for contracts for particularly unpopular officers.
But there was also suicide and self-mutilation that went on, too.
People got desperate. They were disoriented. They were not being cared for by their own command. The actual operations often involve slaughter of innocents. Suicide rates are fairly high. Standing up in the middle of a firefight. There's one famous cartoon book by a man named Tad Forrester, and it shows a picture of a soldier hiding behind a rock with his trigger finger in the air looking for the $1 million wound. The theory being like if he exposed this and got his index finger shot off, that he could get out of the war zone. Or you don't take your malaria pill, and get therefore removed because you're incapacitated with malaria. There were many, many ways where people shooting themselves in the foot. There are lots and lots of stories of self-mutilation. Or you do it to your friend. In other words, if your friend has, say, been wounded twice and you're on a particularly dangerous mission and he's had a premonition of death, which was taken very, very seriously, all combat soldiers are deeply superstitious, then sometimes you shoot or you stab your friend, not in a vital place, but to wound them enough to get them out. You can't fight a war this way. You cannot fight a war where people are, or you go and search and avoid.
Also, yeah, search and avoid. That was a very prevalent thing too. Instead of search and destroy, search and avoid.
That is, you go out and you play war. You try to you go out and you smoke some dope or and you fake some radio reports, or you generally try not to engage the enemy. Yes.
We talked about it every day. All the guys felt the same way. We just weren't accomplishing anything. In fact, some guys were so depressed and disgusted they was killing themselves. Some guys were taking hand grenades and blowing themselves away. They couldn't take the strain anymore. God, is really heavy. I don't think a lot of this stuff was reported. GIs would just kill themselves. In the Army, you'd probably send the stats home that the guy was killed or missing in action.
And did the anti-war movement at home have any effect on these soldiers in creating a sense of what they were doing was wrong, that they were victims, they were making mistakes? Did that have impact, you think, on the soldiers?
There was a wide coffee house, GI coffee house movement. The anti-war movement tried to set up coffee houses near U.S. bases to promote literature and things. But honestly, when you read soldiers' memoirs and novels, they honestly don't talk about the anti-war movement very much. It's not to say there wasn't an influence, but they talk about reacting to the situation of warfare that they're in. The one that, the moral qualms are the moral qualms that are seen on the battlefield. The one clear influence of the anti-war movement is nobody wanted to be the last man to die in Vietnam. I mean, once it was stated that the U.S. was going to withdraw eventually, that made it more difficult.
There was one place in your book where you said that this actually was a class warfare that was going on, and that black soldiers were at the forefront of the fragging and the revolt.
Let's remember who went to Vietnam. After World War II, the U.S. military decided that too many college-educated men had been killed, and that the danger of this was that it was going to hurt the scientific base of the country. If the scientific base of the country was hurt, we couldn't have the next generation of weapons. So the idea of the 2S deferment, of the college deferment, was to keep the pool alive. What this meant was, remember, this is an era of very few student loans, very few scholarships, so on and so forth. It meant that the sons of the middle class could go to college, where the sons of the working class went to the military. In the military itself, military needs vast numbers of white-collar skills. So if you had any kind of clerical skills, like middle-class people often do, typing, filing, so on, you could more readily get a non-combat job. What this translated into is that once you got down to the point of who was in your infantry units, your armor and artillery, they were disproportionately minorities and rural whites, poor urban whites. So we had a working class, largely working class military, combat military, whereas a more middle class anti-war movement and a more middle class logistic apparatus in the military.
So it was a class revolt.
A class revolt. No, I wouldn't call it a revolution. We're not talking about these people. We're not socialists now. But it is sort of like let's revolt against the manager, yes.
It's not in our interest. They're exploiting and using us.
Yes. Yeah, and it's certainly among black soldiers, they were definitely influenced by the Black Power movement. Racial consciousness and critical consciousness was very paramount. And there were many of the tie signs, of bonding signs of, the skin and special handshakes, so on and so forth.
How would you evaluate the mass media handling of Vietnam then and now?
I spent a long time looking at the tapes, and I was close. It's like I'd finished my outline. I was going to write a book about television news coverage of the war, and I decided to think, well, what was not on the news frame? What I saw, and that's consequently I wrote this other book, The Perfect War. What's on the news is a lot of pictures of helicopters, a lot of pictures of jets, a lot of pictures of tanks, a lot of hardware. In which technical war was the major representation, too, visual representation. And along with these presentations of these beautiful weapons, I remember my favorite was an ABC show, an ABC series, where they first went out and they see the battleship New Jersey. Battleship New Jersey had just been recommissioned in '69, and we see here's this 16-inch guns, and there's this giant 30-foot phallus that the camera looks down, and the guy starts talking about it. Shoots a 250-pound projectile 16 miles. It'll go through 32 feet of reinforced concrete, or maybe I have it the other way. Maybe it's 32 miles, 16 feet of reinforced concrete. I forget, and it's a 250-yard kill radius. And it's simply like the man is the correspondent become a salesperson. And I thought, gosh, I too want the battleship New Jersey, this is just cool beyond belief. And then the film cuts, and there's another correspondent, and he's on the bank of a river, and it's about the VC flying trash can. And do you remember the Roadrunner rockets, about Wile E. Coyote was always getting something from Acme Rocket Company that always kind of looked like a trash can on a stick with a kind of triangle on top of it? That's exactly what this rocket looked like. It was obviously of a homemade crude rocket. And the contrast is so great, and it seems like American victory is so ensured because of our technical superiority. Of course, what they don't point out, the Viet Cong who fires that rocket knows exactly what he's shooting at. Was the battleship New Jersey very rarely knew where its bullets were flying.
So
that's what the people saw. People saw that. People did not see very many dead people. There were very few. The death convention on the news was much like a war movie or westerns. No real gore. And they saw a body count each week which showed that we were always winning. We saw one village was burned in 1965, that's it. And the guy correspondent got in severe trouble. My Lai appeared as remember, did not come from, the news of it didn't come from the normal networks, it came from a veteran who tried hard to get the news out. Very little coverage of massacres came on. The ordinary language of the war, gook, slope, slant, dink. No American news correspondent ever talked about those terms and what they meant. Never. It simply did not occur. Instead, it was very much an official perspective. Where one got critical, from 68 on, occasionally you would see reports about failed technology, and occasionally you would see stories about tragic American deaths. But it was sort of like a human interest tragedy becomes the limit of criticism rather than any kind of explanatory notion of why we aren't succeeding.
Bill, let's talk about an evaluation of the Vietnam War. A lot of people have written books about it, historians and generals, and et cetera.
Well, let's end it, just to come back to where we started, to this other point. My analysis says the U.S. had to get out because we couldn't fight, because we had an army that wouldn't do it anymore. Now, you could move to Air Force campaigns, but Air Force campaigns have their problems, too. You can't hold ground with airplanes. Sending money to the South Vietnamese, they were corrupt. They just had more money to be corrupt with. So we were defeated. My analysis says the United States was defeated, and that's the standpoint. So the question is, how have the historians and the novelists, so on, treated the subject of American defeat? The conventional path is a liberal interpretation. That is, it's just a tragedy. It's just things were wrong out there somewhere, and it's just like there were all sorts of small mistakes of honorable men making small decisions.
Arthur Schlesinger being
Arthur Schlesinger would be the most famous, the classical case. Stanley Carnell's book and PBS series, the most recent example. But the notion of tragedy is not an explanation. 20 years of small mistakes doesn't explain a war that has a very clear structure, which is my argument, and if the structural contradictions of that mode of warfare ended in its dissolution and failure. The second school, the most prominent right now, is that the U.S. lost because of self-imposed restraints. Self-imposed restraints is a military term often used in Joint Chiefs of Staff documents calling for escalated air war. And their vision is that the United States should have invaded North Vietnam in 1966 and taken Hanoi and Haiphong. Of course, the only problem with that, every one of those peasants who had those guns shooting against the aircraft, the jet fighter pilots, they were also organized and prepared for invasion. And Doug, you mentioned you mentioned the fact that the North Vietnamese didn't have very many troops in the South. That was one of the major reasons. It wasn't that they didn't want to help their comrades and their Southern comrades. It was troops were being held back in part to protect the home front against a possible American invasion. According to Giap, the plan to fight a U.S. invasion was to let local militia and regional forces fight for the first day to 2 days. So once the Americans were tired, after 24 to 48 hours of constant combat, then the North Vietnamese army would enter the scene. In other words, this notion that the U.S. could have had a successful invasion is just the most bizarre, unreal, fantasy, unworthy of any kind of serious consideration. And even if they had put an expeditionary force in Hanoi and Haiphong, that wouldn't change the class structure in South Vietnam. That wouldn't change the fact that you had a peasantry that wanted land, that you wanted Buddhists who wanted self-determination rather than Catholic rule, and that a whole country wanted national reunification because the whole basis of the culture was throwing out the foreign invader, and that's all they'd done all their lives for 2,000 years was throw out the Chinese, the French, and now the Americans. It wouldn't have changed it. The self-imposed restraint still is false.
Well, have we learned anything since then? You point out the total corruption and self-delusion of the military and the civilian leaders throughout this. First of all, thinking they could wage a techno-war, and secondly, not paying attention to the realities which might try to seep up from the intelligence field, suppressing any intelligence that would contrary to what they wanted. Are we still in that same mode of thinking?
Yes.
And are we thinking of applying it to?
Well, we already have a couple of places. Certainly, Grenada was one example. We took Grenada, and we just barely took it, even though there was a minimum opposition. Most of the U.S. Special Forces commandos bit the dust in various operations because of the various mishaps of one kind or another. Also, the military's analysis is, well, not only did we fight with one hand tied behind our back, but we fought too slow. We needed more rapid escalation. So Honduras has been prepared, a series of airfields and ports have been prepared in Honduras in order to bring 50,000 troops into battle within a week. They have the facilities for this. And they still have, many of the military have the delusion that they could probably take Managua and a few other places in a couple of weeks, rather than an extensive Central American war which would escalate tremendously, because the Nicaraguans have no choice except to expand the war outside of Nicaragua to make the battlefield bigger. If the battlefield's bigger, then the United States has to disperse its troops. If its troops are dispersed, you can't achieve victory.
Back to Vietnam.
Back to Vietnam.
Sounds like they haven't learned a thing.
They have not learned a thing. But then most haven't learned a thing. There are veterans, of course, in the U.S. who certainly don't want to see this. There are probably parts of the military in very subordinate positions who don't want to see a major escalation. But generally we're on track for another kind of major intervention. Whether or not it will be, since the Iran-Agua crisis has emerged, that may be off for a while. I don't know. But there's certainly Philippines. There's another growing insurgency there. The chances for another major intervention and another series of self-delusions are very, very high, because the people, the officer corps who were successful in Vietnam are the people who are in charge now. The people who were the dissidents, the few handfuls of lieutenant colonels and majors who just got repulsed, they got out. They resigned. Most of them did.
Ironically, the Army itself recognized this in 1970 in a War College study, which indicated that there is a significant difference between the ideal Army values such as honesty, integrity, bravery, justice, and responsibility, and the real values which are practiced by the military in order to promote career advancement. Here is the study's conclusion. The present climate does not appear to be self-correcting. The human drives for success and recognition by seniors, sustained, if not inflamed, by the system of rewards and management which cater to immediate personal success at the expense of moral and ethical values, would appear to only be perpetuated by the current environment. The fact alone that the leaders of the future are those who survived and excelled within the rules of the present system militates in part against any self-starting incremental return toward the practical application of ideal Army values.
And then the final reason I note the problem of learning is that there are cultural reasons that make the American people want to believe the self-imposed restraint school. And that is, we are used to the tradition of the cowboy who comes in and saves a society against the enemies when the power structure cannot defend itself. The idea of a weak authority that has to be saved by a warrior shows up in many places in American culture. In the Western, in the detective hero is outside the law. All the Superman and the Masked Avenger figures of the 20s and 30s certainly are able to foil criminals that legal authorities cannot.
But also, isn't there a deep belief that technology cannot fail
certainly
in American culture, that if we have enough technological or military force, we can't help but win a war?
It's hard not to believe in your hardware. Americans don't learn about social relations. They don't learn about class structure every day in the newspaper or about cultural history every day in the newspaper. They learn about what's for sale.
Then what is the lesson of Vietnam concerning the limits of techno-war, the situations in which
techno-war can destroy, but it cannot achieve victory. It can destroy land, it can destroy people, but it can't create a government, it can't create a culture, it can't create a society.
I mean, this was another thing we tried to do in Vietnam, to impose the model of the consumer society on them and American-style supposed democracy, where there'd be elections, in situations where these just couldn't work.
Oh, well, it did work in a way. In other words, yeah, people can become corrupted. They did get into their drugs and their Hondas and things, but it just doesn't build a stable society. It doesn't build people who are willing to die for that society. That was the whole problem they had. You had plenty of corrupted Vietnamese, but when it looks like things were near, they weren't willing to go out and defend Saigon to the death, or not. They bought their tickets out to the United States.
Whereas the peasants were willing to fight to death just for land.
Yes.
And just for getting rid of their landlords or local oppressors.
Yes.
It made perfect sense to them.
And there's been this problem, the so-called Vietnam Syndrome, which our leaders have been complaining about all these years, as if there was a sickness in the land. The Americans,
a loss of will to fight, yes.
But it looks like the American public had a clearer picture of what the war was all about than the leaders. But how would you assess that, and do you think that they were overcoming that Vietnam Syndrome now so that they can...
Well, I don't think the American public ever had an idea what was wrong. They just knew something was wrong and that it wasn't getting better. In fact, I think indeed their fuzziness made it easier for people to believe the self-imposed restraint school, to believe that we lost because we didn't fight hard enough. For the past few years, popular culture has presented the hero, the warrior imagery as well, very much strong on the rise. We've had many classical war movies made and several kind of variant war movies made. It's definitely a war culture. How people, though, clearly, though, there's still a resistance. There's still a certain level in which the disaster of Vietnam is etched in at least some people's memories, and even though they don't have an understanding of why it failed or what the structural reasons, there is a fear that it will happen again.